Myself first. I'm Celine Smith. I've been doing workshops at Harvest for a couple of years now. And a little bit about my background and why I am interested in cultural um, issues is that I studied cultural anthropology in undergrad along with international studies. And then I also did Peace Corps in Nepal and lived there for just over 2 years. And ever since then, I've been engaging in intercultural topics. It's a huge passion of mine. And when I returned to the US, I first started working for a refugee youth foster care as a mentor tutor coordinator, and I would give trainings. I would give trainings about intercultural communication, cultural humility, along with other things. But that was really my passion. So I kind of altered and formed that workshop around what we're going to be talking about today. Um, and usually I try to have my trainings and workshops be super interactive. So I'm trying to make it interactive in a way that we all won't be actively interacting, but hopefully these are questions that you can be thinking about yourself as we move along. And I'll also share my experiences of having given these trainings and what happened during activities that we were doing in person as we go along. Okay, so as an intro, I like to generally start off with people sharing the story behind their names because our names actually tell really deep stories of who we are and the cultures that we come from. So, for example, my name is Celine Therese Smith. Celine comes from Saint Therese and her sister Celine, thus also my middle name. So that tells you that my family comes from a Catholic background, right? And also, the last name Smith comes from my father's last name, which is generally the pattern in the culture I come from that shows that it's a patriarchal society, that the names come from the man's family. Now, not all countries do the same thing. In Somalia, your middle name is your dad's last name, and your last name is your grandfather's name. So that also tells you something about the values of or the structure of their society. And in some cultures, they don't even have middle names. But some people might even have a story in their name, and that there is no meaning behind their name. That could also have some significance. So, anyways, just it's just a fun way to kind of introduce and share and think about what does your name say about you? Also, just to start thinking, like, what is your definition of culture? So, for example, some people might say that it's religion. Religion can be informative of culture. That the U.S. There's a general culture in the U.S. Um, so, generally, culture is defined as the shared set of implicit and explicit values, ideas, concepts, and rules of behavior that allow a social group to function and perpetuate itself. Also, super important to mention that culture is ever evolving, it's not stagnant. Everyone plays a part in adding to culture. Also, there's subcultures. So there's the overarching larger cultures, but within that, there are also subgroups. So, example being that there are there are religious cultures, like Christianity has a culture within it, but within that, women might have a certain type of cultural expectation or perpetuation of certain ideas versus men or people that are non-gender conforming. So there is going to be different subcultures within those larger cultures. Usually I'd have more conversation and discussion about these things, but I'm going to be just kind of continuously talking. Hopefully I'm not going too fast. So, the takeaways from today are, first of all, just so that we can understand more of our own cultural lens. So then we can also embrace the concept of cultural humility rather than cultural competency. So, generally, people talk about cultural competency, that's what we want to aim for. But actually, the newer discussion is to have cultural humility. And we're going to get a little bit more into that. But first, it's important to dig a little bit deeper into our own cultural lenses. Okay, so first I like to start off with this activity just to get people thinking about how certain are you about the beliefs that you hold. So for generally I'll have people line up and move along, but we're just going to do this seated, but imagine this to yourself, right? So I'm going to name some statements and you think about how certain you are if this is acceptable or unacceptable behavior. So, first one is to be on your phone during a meeting, or you can also imagine texting during a meeting. How acceptable is that? Think about that. And then also to call someone fat. To call someone fat, is that acceptable or not acceptable? How about to shake your hand or hand over something with your left hand? Is that acceptable or unacceptable behavior? How about wearing the same article of clothing every day of the week? Would that be acceptable or unacceptable? Now, as you think about these things, the question might come up, well, it depends on the context. It might be rude to be on your phone during a meeting if it's not necessary, but if you have an emergency, then that's acceptable. Or it might be not rude to wear the same article of clothing every day if I'm at home or around family, but not if I'm out at work every day. But that's an important thing to think about because context does matter. But in some cultures, these things are completely unacceptable all the time, no matter the context. So I would argue that in American culture, it's always rude to call someone fat. That is something that is very ingrained in all of us, whether we like it or not. And some of us are actively working to change our mindset around this, but still, the overarching larger culture thinks it's negative to point out someone's weight or size. But in other cultures, it's actually not only common, but seen as a positive thing, that it's a compliment to call someone fat. So when I was living in Nepal, people would comment on my weight all the time. They would say, "You're looking so fat today," or "Oh my gosh, you've gained weight. That's so like wow." And I always felt so negative about it. It made me feel really bad. And they just couldn't understand why I didn't see that as a good thing. So one thing that really got me was after I had been in Nepal for a year, in the same village for a year, I saw this woman at the health post and she looked really gaunt. She looked like she had lost weight. She looked just unhealthy. And it made me concerned. Do they not have enough food? Has she been ill? Like, it made me really worried for her. And that's when it hit me with understanding of experience that it's a positive thing to be fat because it shows that you have the resources. You're more likely to be healthy. You're more likely to be able to survive an illness or a season without as much food. So it really helped me to understand how my cultural lens was informed by my lifestyle in the US versus in Nepal, where in village, it's just a totally different lifestyle and that's a totally different cultural expectation. Also, in many cultures, it's very rude to hand stuff over with your left hand because that's the hand you use for wiping. So, so you're going to use your dirty hand that you wipe with to hand something over to someone. That you can see why that would be seen as offensive. Also, in many cultures, people wear the same article of clothing every day for various reasons. Maybe it's that they don't have many options of clothing. Um, Anyways, you see where I'm going. But the point being that there's so many contexts and context matters. And we're going to go more into that. Okay. So, a note on culture before we continue on is that culture is like a fishbowl. You're swimming in the fishbowl and you're not aware of how the bowl is framing the way that you look at the world and distorting and changing how you look at the world until you jump out of the fishbowl and see how there's different ways that you could be seeing the world. So, what lens do you see the world through? What is your fishbowl? That's why a lot of people say it's helpful to travel or see another culture because it helps you to reflect on your own. But you don't have to travel. That's not the only way to do it, but that is a way to do it. So one of the reasons this is important, an important topic, is because this also affects ethnocentricity. Now, ethnocentricity, what it means in its essence, is that we apply our own cultural view as a frame of reference in order to judge other cultures instead of using the standards of the particular culture involved. So I'm going to judge something that I see in someone else's culture based off of my own cultural understanding rather than using their cultural understanding and their cultural standards to judge that idea. So I was doing that. I was judging how people were calling me fat and how rude that was out of my own cultural framework, which was ethnocentric. Now, ethnocentricity is just a form of bias. We all have bias. Bias is inevitable. We're all going to look at something from an ethnocentric viewpoint. We're all going to look at it from our own cultural lens, right? But the point is, the question is, how do we step out of that lens? And how do we start to look at things from a more humble standpoint of, I don't know, or I can't be the judge of because I don't know this cultural standard or this cultural way. So it's kind of learning how to step out of your own way and step out of your own lens and begin to question. Questioning is really the key. So a really helpful spot to start is with the cultural iceberg. So we're all familiar with what an iceberg looks like as shown here, that only 10% of culture is visible, the top part of the iceberg, and then 90% of culture lies beneath the surface. Now, at one point, I started to ask, well, why not use a different symbol for this? Why not use like a beam of a building that goes deep into the ground? Well, it's important here that the iceberg juts out and goes out in really odd ways that you can't see beneath the surface. It's not just straight down and easy to define and easy to know where it is. Awareness aids navigation. So being aware of all the potential underneath is where it's going to really help us in our quest to understand and learn about culture. So what is it that lies above and beneath the surface of the iceberg? Usually when people talk about culture, they're talking about what lies above the surface, above the water. So we're looking at food, music, language, festivals, dress, games. That's stuff that when you go to a cultural festival, you're going to see a lot of that stuff. And they interact with each other. But there's all this stuff that lies beneath the surface that informs how we interact with so much. So that's where some of the issues are going to come in of misunderstandings or being offended or not agreeing with another culture is probably going to come from the things beneath the surface. So some of those examples are the values that we hold, our religious beliefs. Body language is huge. Gender roles, leadership styles, notions of modesty, even how you process your thoughts, views on raising children, concepts of fairness, notions of cleanliness, importance of time. Now, these things all are very important to how we've been raised. I have a very strong opinion on how children should be raised, even though I don't even have children of my own, right? Like that's something that a lot of people generally have strong opinions on, even if they don't have their own. So it's going to be hard to see outside of that lens, outside of that box, unless you're really actively working on stepping outside of that ethnocentric idea. It doesn't mean that you can't hold your own beliefs or that you can't believe strongly on something, but it's about interacting with the questions of it and deciding whether you can be the judge. That's a really important part of the cultural humility. So, also, I want to point out that what's above the surface is impacted by things beneath the surface, right? So, we might be hearing music that is expressing cultural values underneath, and we might be missing some of that, or we might judge it before understanding it. Also, food. That's a huge part that food can demonstrate gender roles. Who eats the food first? Who's cooking the food and preparing it? Who gets the leftovers? Who has to do the cleaning afterwards? All that is really wrapped up too in cultural norms. So these things that seem surface level actually also hold a lot of importance in relation to everything that's beneath the surface. And beneath the surface, I just want to add before I move on, beneath the surface is where we tend to butt heads. I know I mentioned that earlier, but for example, I might view the stuff above and be like, oh yeah, we're from a different culture because we're wearing different clothes or whatnot. But they should know that they have to be on time for things. That's rude that they're late, right? I can respect what's above the surface and then harshly judge something that's below the surface and not recognize how that's coming from ethnocentricity. So to question that what you take as offensive, it might not be offensive. There might be a reason for it. And we're actually going to use time as an example of that later. Okay, so that's the next slide actually is concepts of time are a huge one of the major first big bumps in the road during intercultural interactions. When people go to other countries, they talk about how meetings never run on time, buses don't run on time, people are late to meetings. I know in Peace Corps, people talk about that a lot. We'll try to set up a meeting, people come an hour late and just walk in like no big deal. Americans are generally used to running on time, and that's the dominant culture in the US. Not every subcultural group in the US agrees with that. But that's an expectation. So I really, really like this example because it's so deep. So in cultures that don't run on time in the way that people from my culture would assume is correct. So I'm going to use the example of Nepal because that's where I have the most experience. So in village, when one is a farmer, they have to work when the weather allows it. They have a view of not being able to control time as Americans do. So it's not so much as I work from 8 to 5, it's I work when the weather allows me to or when it's best. And that also means I need to rest when it's best and when I can't work. So also people walk to most places in village. So when you're walking, you're more likely to come across social interactions. When I'm driving and I see someone, they know I can't stop and talk to them. But if I'm walking and I don't stop and talk to them, that has a different connotation, right? So when you're walking through a village and you see your neighbor, and if you don't stop to say hi and you're just like, hey, gotta go, running late, that's going to be seen as rude in a way that the culture I come from won't view as rude. So if I don't stop and say, hi, how are you? How is your family doing? Check in and make sure that they're doing all right and really make sure to forge that connection, I'm potentially severing social ties. So that takes time, right? To take that step aside, to ask those questions. You might get wrapped into a conversation. You're once again in that view of I can't control time. I'm going with the flow of what happens. And it's really important in places like Village in Nepal to maintain those social connections because not only because you want to, but also because you help each other with each other's harvests. You help each other with planting season. It's a part of your survival to be interconnected in a way that we don't need to necessarily be. In the US, I would argue that we do need to be, but people don't think that they do, or yeah, it gets complex. But people get away without being super inextricably connected in the US. And so another part of that I wanted to mention is that so in the US, what happens is that when someone comes from another country and comes here, they're still working out of that framework. And so they might be told to get to a meeting, but they're going to make sure to make all those social connections along the way or just not feel that rush because they weren't raised with that rush. And that's not a personal offense to you. And so that's just something I've seen a lot within Peace Corps, within refugees in the US, and with people that have traveled abroad is they talk a lot about and it's talked about in a way that's judging the other person. It's a way that as if the other person is immoral or not as civilized, quote unquote, because they're not running on time. And so I think that there's so much value in why people don't run on time. There's actually so much meaning and importance behind that I think that we lose from running on time in the US. So the point is of being able to see the value of both. There might be cons, but there's also pros to both ways of being. So another one is the sense of place or the sense of direction. So in the US, we tend to run off of a sense of direction, either whether it be cardinal directions or it might be based off of right or left, front or behind. So in some cultures, they don't run on either of those things, but rather they run specifically off of where you are in your environment. So people might be based off of where the mountains are located, where the stream is located. But so why does this matter? How does this affect how we interact with the world? Well, there's this example of this boy that grew up in a small village who was an excellent dancer. And he was sent to the larger city to take dance lessons. And this was his first time ever leaving village. So when he was for the first time leaving and going to these dance lessons, the dance instructor was telling him where to move. And she was using these directions that the boy did not understand. Rather than recognizing that that was the issue, she saw it as him not being a good dancer. Why was he sent here? He doesn't know how to dance. He can't even take any of my directions. But this was his first time ever leaving, so he wasn't aware of where north, east, south, and west was because he didn't have his normal markers, right? So there was this misunderstanding of his ability level rather than it being a miscommunication. Also, when people in some cultures, they don't have any reference of it being to my right, to my left, in front, or behind, they don't use themselves as the center. They are not the center point. It's just maybe cardinal directions. So this fascinates me because when I think about if I wasn't the center of my world, if I wasn't basing directions off of me as being the center, but I had to be centered in my environment and I had to always be aware of my environment and I was just a small actor and a part within it, how would that how would that change my view and the way that I interact with the world? To me, to me that means that I would have to have an understanding and connection to nature at all times and not have this egocentric view of me as being the center. So I just think that's fascinating and presents a lot of potential for how we could interact with problem solving differently and just the way that we respect nature. So another thing that might differ based off of cultures is definitions of success. Some people define success based off of money. Some people base it off of social relationships. Not to say that one is necessarily better than the other, but they're just different. Just because one culture views one as one way as the other, there's going to be pros and cons for both potentially. Another one, humility versus pride, right? So in some cultures, that it's very revered to be very humble and to not talk about yourself, not talk about any of your good qualities or your successes because it's seen as bragging. Whereas in other cultures, we talk openly about our successes, about our good qualities. I would argue that the US is a very pride based culture. We are told to learn how to talk about ourselves. Not everybody does, right? But we have to learn how to sell ourselves. We talk about that in interviews, especially. But I think that we kind of do that in a lot of different ways. But an example I use of this is I have a friend who was raised in the Netherlands and she moved to the US. And she said it always made her so uncomfortable how Americans talked about themselves because she viewed them as so boastful and proud in a way that was really negative. It just made her feel super uncomfortable because she was raised to be very humble and not talk about her positive qualities. Now, like a true American that I am, when she told me that story, that made me feel really sad for her. I was like, oh my gosh, you can't talk about your positive qualities, but you're so amazing. And that makes me so sad for you. But for her, that wasn't a sad thing. That was a part of her culture. And it was a positive thing to be humble. And to her, it was uncomfortable that like we could so easily talk about our positives. Now, when I say the we, I don't mean everyone. Obviously, there's a lot of gradients within that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. Okay, so another thing that differs is cultural beliefs slash superstitions. So I put beliefs slash superstitions because people tend to have a very negative connotation to superstitions or a certain belief around superstitions, but truly that is what it is. It's a belief. So one superstition that I like to start with is that in Somalia, there's this idea of the evil eye. And the evil eye is something that um, when someone gives you a compliment, a direct compliment, it's placing a curse or an illness on the recipient. So if I was to give a direct comment without saying, may God be with you at the end of it, I am putting a curse on you, right? So in that might seem odd to some people not from that culture, like to not be able to give a direct compliment. I want to give you a compliment. That's coming from a positive space. But to some cultures, that's viewed as a negative. Now, I like to draw some correlations there. How do we see similarities to that in the culture that you come from? So, from my personal experience, that sounds like me the idea of don't jinx me. If someone says, you're going to do awesome, get a goal, and you say, don't jinx me, it's that same idea that someone is putting a curse or putting this illness on you by giving you that compliment of being like, I know you can do it. I know you're going to get that goal. Right. Or another idea of that is that sometimes I've heard people say, oh, that person compliments me too much. I wonder what they want from me or what they're trying to get from me. So there is also this understanding of compliments potentially having this negative connotation to it as well. So superstitions, while they might appear in certain stories or be explained in certain ways, the beliefs tend to supersede one individual culture. We tend to see these flows throughout many different cultures. And just a common superstition in the US is that if you open an umbrella inside, that you're bringing bad luck to yourself, that you're walking under a ladder brings bad luck. And another one, a black cat crossing the road is bad luck in front of you. That's a common superstition in many different cultures. And also, we may say that we don't follow superstitions or like, oh, just in case I'm going to knock on wood, but I don't actually believe it, but just in case. But black cats are the hardest to adopt cats at humane societies. So while we say that we don't act on those things, we also don't know that our unconscious bias against these things is working against us. So when we go to a humane society, oh, I have this preference for this white cat or this tiger striped cat or this tabby cat. I don't want the black cat, not because I believe in the superstition, but just because there is just something about it that I don't like. Well, what is it that there's that something about it that you don't like? There's that cultural belief underlying there. Now, these things obviously bleed into many different topics, but I just find it very fascinating. And these things cross all around the world. I actually had an interesting conversation with a Bosnian woman about how they knock on wood too, to not jinx themselves, but they knock from underneath up to the sky to send it to heaven. So it's just interesting how these things cross a lot of cultures. Okay, so there was this very fascinating University of Michigan study that talks about how, depending on the culture you come from, you may actually see things differently. So, what they did was they took US born grad students and Chinese grad students and they had them look at pictures and they tracked their eye movements while looking at the photos. And then they asked them about the photos afterwards. And what they found was that US born grad students were more likely to spend more time of their eye movement focusing on the focal point of the picture rather than spending equal amounts of time looking at the whole picture. Whereas Chinese born grad students were more likely to spend equal amounts of time with their eye tracking across the whole photo. So when they asked them about the photo afterwards, what was the result? Well, Chinese born grad students were more likely to remember and include parts of the photo that were not the focal point, whereas US born grad students were not as likely to remember the points that weren't the focal point of the photo. So that can actually change our experience during the looking of the photo, but it can also affect how we remember and how we interact with that experience afterwards. And that can change how we understand the whole situation. If you're missing out on stuff that's in the background, you could be missing out on essential information that informs the whole experience. So it actually changes how you interact with things based off of your cultural understanding of what is important in the photo. In the US, we're told the focal point is the most important part. So that's what you focus the most time on. So, an example of that, so when you see this and you see the words and the colors, and I tell you to read me the words on the screen, it can feel like hard, right? Like your head, it just like, like the gears stop and turn backwards. It's really hard, right? But also, it's interesting to me because when you look at this slide, without the colors in the background, it might be a little easier, right? And then you add more things to it, you make it a little bit more complex. But in the US, we're told that the words are the most important part of a page. We're more likely to spend time with our eye movements on words than on other parts of the page. And so if I tell someone to read me off this page, someone might read it to me from another culture. They might read it to me from the colors. They might read it green, blue, white, red, purple. But someone from the US is going to read it to me as blue, green, stop, purple, red. So also, it's going to vary on obviously if you are literate or not, but there's an importance placed on words more so than the color, whereas other cultures might focus on other parts. There's many cultures that have only gotten a written language within the last couple decades or maybe the last century. So their culture might not be as focused on words as a culture like the dominant culture in the US is. So we might view things differently and focus time on certain on a page on certain areas than others. These are just all ways to point out how we are literally shaping the way that we view and interact with the world based off of what we've been raised to believe is important. So understanding that there's other ways of being, other ways of understanding, can help to just open up our minds to recognizing that there's so much about the world that we don't understand, and there's so many other potential ways of interacting with the world that we don't understand. That's just really exciting. Okay, so I have an activity, um, and I'm just gonna kind of ask you to just think about these things as we go along. So what it is, it's a silent auction, and I'm gonna present different photos, different pieces of art, and I want you to think about what you would pay for the item and what you think that this item would be worth. Okay, and then we'll discuss kind of the importance and significance afterwards. So this is the first one. It's a painting. It's a relatively large painting. So think about what you would pay for this painting and what you think this painting would be worth. So generally, when I've done this training, people mark this painting relatively low. They would probably pay maybe $10 for it, or maybe they don't even like it or wouldn't put it in their house. Occasionally, I'll get a person that really likes it and would pay a lot of money for it, but that's not the norm. So actually, this painting is worth $9.6 million. It's based off of the painter that painted it and the style that it's in. So that often surprises people. People definitely did not assume when I give this training that this is worth millions of dollars. So this arrowhead, it's about 2.5 inches long. So how much would you pay for it? How much do you assume that it's worth? So generally, people might say that they would pay maybe a couple hundred based off of different factors, right? But actually, at auction, this was estimated to sell for $1,000 to $2,000, but sold for 13,800, and that's based off of the historical significance of the arrowhead. So here's this beautiful rug from it's a Persian rug from ancient from Iran. So, how much would you pay for this large area room rug, and how much do you think it's worth? Now, generally, people will say maybe a couple hundred, maybe a couple thousand. But actually, this rug was sold for 33.7 million. $33.7 million. So the reason why is because this is an ancient Persian rug, and it was used in the kingdom in the palace. And it's actually artisans make these rugs, and they're very sought after. What about this chair, this sofa chair? I've had people say I wouldn't pick that up off the side of the road, when they've looked at this photo. I've had other people say that they like it. They would spend a couple $100s on it. Actually, this chair sold for $28 million because there's a love story attached to it. It was made by this artist for their lover, and then they gifted it to another artist to give to their lover. So the history of the importance of who owned it, who made it for whom, added to the importance and significance of this chair. What about this painting? Now, I've had different opinions on this painting, but whether people liked it or not, this painting is actually worth $2.4 million. It was painted by an Aboriginal artist in Australia and hangs up in the Museum of Aboriginal Art there. And it's that history and who made it and the artistic background and specific unique taste to it that gives it that significance. And what about this here? This colorful tree. I've had people tell me that this is their favorite piece of art that I've shown so far. That's why I chose it, because it's my favorite. But actually, this is just something I found on Etsy and is only worth $32. So some people have told me that since this is their favorite one out of all of them, that they would spend hundreds on this. But actually, it's worth the least amount because it's made by someone on Etsy. Nobody knows who the person is, and it doesn't have any cultural significance yet. And then this last one, the ever knowing Mona Lisa, very familiar. So it actually has the highest insurance out of any art piece in the world, valued at over $100 million in insurance value. And so a lot of people know that, but a lot of people also say that they don't really care for the painting themselves. They wouldn't necessarily hang it up in their house. They would just buy it to have it because of its worth. So the point being of all of these things is that culture adds context and value. At face value, when looking at these things, you don't understand the importance, you don't really value it, you might even throw it on the side of the road. But when you get to know the meaning, the deeper meaning and significance behind it, the cultural value, it is so significant and it makes all the difference in the world. I had someone once who was an art history major tell me, but the Mona Lisa is so valuable. You know, it was the first time that this technique was used and all this other stuff. And I just told her, you know, I'm not saying that it doesn't hold, that it's not valuable. That is valuable. And that's why it's so important. But that's the same reason why these other pieces are super important, but you don't know from just looking at it. And that's why every cultural interaction needs to be looked at from that lens of I might not understand the significance behind this. I might not understand the value, but just to know that there's so much potential beneath the surface, to be inquisitive and interested, and to not take anything for face value. I might sit next to uh, a dignitary of another country or a president of another country and not know who they are and treat them like any other person. But you know that if I'm sitting next to President Obama on the plane, I'm going to be freaking out and acting different because I know that this is Obama sitting next to me on this plane. As much as I would like to say I treat everyone equally, it's a goal of mine that I'm still working on. So I know that I would treat Obama differently than someone else, but it's based off of that context, right? It's based off of that history, the knowledge of the importance and the significance. So I think that that really interacts with our cultural understandings. So I know I'm throwing a lot out there, but this is a really important thing that I want to bring up. It's kind of going off of on a different tangent, but I think that they all interact with each other, and I hope to tie it together at the end. So the coconut versus peach friendship model is really significant for those that go to different cultures and get offended or don't understand an interaction that they have with another person. So the as you can imagine, why we choose a coconut and a peach to represent is that the coconut has a the peach has a soft exterior, but a hard interior. And the coconut has a hard exterior, but a liquid interior. So some common cultures that are coconut cultures are Germany and Russia. And the common peach cultures are USA and Brazil. Now, what does this mean really? So what this means is that it's easy to be in conversation with someone from a peach culture. You can maybe get smiles out of the person, easily start a conversation, but it's really hard to get into their inner circle, to become one of their main core people. But in coconut cultures, it might be a little harder to get to know them. People might not smile as readily. They might not be as ready to open their home to you. Or I'm actually, that's not a good example because people in the US aren't ready to open their homes either. But so, like in a coconut culture, it's hard to get through that exterior, that hard exterior. But once you get through it and once you make that connection and that bond, you are in it. You're floating around in it. You can go stay with the third aunt twice removed cousin that lives out in another country because you know and are good friends with that person. Now, just because I'm really good friends with this person does not mean that my great aunt in Chicago would be willing to let them stay with them. So I am a perfect example of a peach. I am so peachy. I will talk to anyone I want to know. I'll share with you anything. I want to know everything about you. But for you to actually be in my inner circle, the people that I actually hang out with in my free time, that I'm going to go meet up with for coffee, that I'm going to really call to for help, that's a few and far in between. And I'll say I'll go to coffee with people, but what I really mean is that I hope that happens, but I'm not going to make sure it happens. But if it happens, I'll do it and I'm going to love it. But it might not be my top priority. Whereas someone from a coconut culture, if they agree to go to coffee with you, that's a significant thing, and they're going to follow through with it and make sure that that happens. So there's this great example of this person from Germany and a person from the US on an airplane together. They're coming over to the US and they're sitting next to each other. The American starts asking tons of questions. Have a long plane ride. They think they might as well get to know their neighbor and make it interesting. So they're asking all these questions, and the German thinks that they are so nosy. Like, why would I answer these questions? Why would I share these things with them? But they finally, break into it and are like, okay, well, we do have 8 hours, and this person is fairly nice, so I'll interact with them. So by the end of the flight, they feel like they've really formed this close bond, and they have really enjoyed the conversation after having opened up. And they're like, wow, I have this friend in the US now. So they go to leave, and this German is so excited. And the American just goes, well, it's nice to meet you, bye, and walks off without sharing a phone number or an email. And the German is so offended. They're like, wow, that person is so fake. I can't believe, they feel very hurt because the American just walked off. But that is a perfect example of peach and coconut. So I have my same friend who moved over from the Netherlands to Alaska. She thought that Americans were so fake. They would say, let's meet up for coffee sometime, or let me know if you need help for anything, but they would never follow through, and they wouldn't make sure that they stayed in contact. So she had a really hard time making friends here. But I can also understand being that peachy person, because that's me. I have some really core friends, but I have a lot of surface friends too, which I find them very valuable as well. I think that there's value to both, but I think what gets really complicated is when the two interact and don't understand that one is peach and one is coconut, and they get offended because they take it personally. There's pros and cons to being both ways, right? So it's not to say that one is better than the other, but just that we have to acknowledge that there's these differences. And if you can talk about them, then that might help to bridge any of those misunderstandings. So, a quick note is that cultures often have similar roots, but they may be expressed differently. So, what do I mean by that? Is that every culture obviously has a sense of humor or jokes, right? But they don't find all the same jokes funny. Some people might actually say that a certain culture isn't funny because they don't laugh at certain jokes or find certain things funny, which just obviously is not very true. But there are some things that are also universal. So one thing that I found in many of my travels, I've been to many different countries around the world, is that when you laugh at your own mistakes, that tends to be pretty universal, and people join in with you. And that also mothers will overfeed you everywhere. If they have the ability to overfeed you, mothers will overfeed you everywhere. So I just think that's a fun universal to recognize that while there may be many differences, that there are some similarities that cross cultures as well. So now this is how I kind of wanted to wrap up a lot of things is, does everyone demonstrate the values and culture of their society? Because as I've been talking, you might have been listening and said, well, I was born in the US, but that doesn't apply to me. I don't feel like a peach. I feel more like a coconut, or I don't run on time. I run late to things all the time, right? So like obviously not everyone demonstrates the values of their culture, of their society, but there's this overarching understanding of what people are accepting or expect, what people expect, the overarching expectations. And there might be subcultures within that, or you might totally disagree with it and be actively working against it. But there is an understanding that there is this overarching expectation. So, one example I use is that extroverts and introverts obviously exist everywhere, and everything in between, ambiverts as well. But So in China, they value introversion. And in the US, we tend to value extroversion. So that doesn't mean that there aren't introverts in the US or that there aren't extroverts in China, but the overarching values of the society value the extrovert or the introvert. Like in the US, we give participation points. We tend to view leaders as those that um, uh, share lots of ideas and talk a lot. Like we view MLK as a leader because he talked at a lot of protests and he was obviously a very significant figure. But there was also many leaders behind the scenes that were maybe more introverts, but they were still leaders too. And in China, they view a lot of introverts as being leaders, leading from within. Also, extroverts in China, if you talk a lot, the idea kind of is that you have a lot of fluff in your head. That you're not necessarily thinking everything through. So it's not to say that those people don't exist in those cultures, but just that there's an overarching value. So some of us might have been challenging cultural norms from a young age, but we were still raised with this understanding of this is what you will face in the larger society. So that is also an important thing to then place on other when you're interacting with people from other cultures. Just because you have this experience of another culture does not mean that those people are going to fit within those boxes that may be the overarching value of that culture, but you can't pinpoint them and say that they then have these beliefs or they then are going to act this way because they're from that culture. Just because today I told you that um, Russia and Germany are coconut cultures does not mean that everyone that you meet from those places are going to be like coconuts. They might be peachy. So, what does that bring us to? That brings us to cultural humility, the awareness that we cannot know everything and that's a never ending process of learning and that we must remain curious. So, just because I lived in Nepal for 2.5 years, or just over 2 years, does not mean that I can speak to Nepali culture. I can speak to my experience in Nepal and recognize that I have this limited experience. But so when I talk about it, I tend to say in my village, X, Y, and Z. Because if I say in Nepal, there's large cities in Nepal, like Kathmandu and Pokhara. There's different cultures within Nepal. So I can't speak to Nepal as a whole, even though I can say, well, maybe there might be a leaning more towards this or another, but I can't know. And I need to remain curious and open and recognize that I can't generalize, that I can only speak to my own experience. Now, that's something I have to work on and remind myself of all the time because there will be times where I'll say, oh, well, in Nepal, they do this. And then I have to remind myself, oh, I can't speak like that. So it's a process of reminding yourself, right? But we must remain curious and keep asking those questions. So the ideal behind cultural competency is that there's an ending point. I am now competent because I've learned X, Y, and Z about this culture. But that is dangerous because then it kind of shuts down the questioning and the wondering if it's true or if there's more to learn. You might start making assumptions that could be hurtful. So there's an example of a nurse that is going to work in a predominantly Hispanic population, and she's moving to the area. So she decides to learn as much as she can. It's predominantly a Mexican suburb, a city. And so she learns as much as she can about Mexico, Mexican culture, how they tend to be very Christian, maybe Catholic. And so she goes to work there and she's like, I know it. I've learned as much as I can. I know what I'm doing. So she goes there and she's interacting with a patient, and this patient is actually, unfortunately, going to be taken off life support, and they're going to go into hospice care. So she goes ahead and calls in a Catholic priest. And then when the Catholic priest comes in, the person's very offended because they're Jewish. They're like, why didn't you ask? That's the danger of cultural competency, of assuming you know and acting based off of those assumptions rather than asking the person. Because just because there's these overarching cultural views does not mean that the person is going to be a part of that dominant culture. So basically, we were all raised to fit in these certain boxes. We were raised to fit in the cultural square. And so we formed to be a square, while another culture had a triangular shape that they were trying to fit everybody into. And so they might have formed more like a triangle. So what happens when you try to take the square and fit it into the triangle, or the triangle and try to fit it into the square? There's going to be misunderstandings and there's going to be parts that don't fit and there's going to be bumps in the road. So how do you be malleable? How, instead of being made out of stone and be a square? How do you be made out of Play-Doh and be a square? Right. So that's the way I like to look at it. It's a constant practice, a constant reminder. And while it's fun and I love learning about all these different cultural beliefs and different ways of understanding the world, rather than looking at it as, oh, now I understand and now I get it, I look at it as another example of how I will never know everything and how there's so many other ways of understanding. So I have to remain curious and just keep learning as much as I can. So this might seem pretty basic, but my last slide and my last part is what statements work for you to remind yourself to remain culturally humble and remain interested and curious. These are super basic questions, but it's really important to remember them in the moments that these situations arise. So, recognizing that when something comes up, you might remind yourself that I am unsure. I actually don't know everything about this situation. To ask the question, could you tell me more? What does that mean to you? Why is that significant? Um, to respond with, I don't know when you don't know, rather than trying to come up with an answer when you don't know something. Just acknowledge that you don't know and that maybe you should ask someone else or look into things deeper. Also, just looking at every situation as I'd love to learn. I want to learn more. I want to know more. I don't want to assume that I know. I don't want to show off what I know. I want to learn more. Also, why? I think that's one of the best things in Peace Corps that Peace Corps does, because I think there's a lot of issues with international development, but that's a whole other topic. But is that you are in another place that you're asking them why they do things and they're asking you why you do the things you do. Not to try to change each other's minds, but it presents this outside person to make you think, oh, why do I do that? Or now I'm learning why someone else does that. So there's this great exchange of understanding how people interact with things differently. And it also forces you to reflect on, why do I wash my face in the morning rather than at night? Why do I put a tree up in December if I'm not Christian? Why do I do these things? Or why do I wear this color or participate in this one event? It makes you start to reflect on your own culture as well when other people ask you why, or when you ask yourself why about a cultural event. So I threw a lot out there. I could go on about all these topics forever. It was hard to try to fit it into 55 minutes. I could have taken it all, and I could talk about this every day, all day. So at the end, I just want to share some references with you. These two references that I have here are some of the things that I referenced in this workshop about different definitions of culture and ethnocentrism, and the University of Michigan study. But I also want to recommend a TED Talk. Wade Davis is who really inspires me in anthropology, and he has this great TED Talk called Dreams from Endangered Cultures. And he has great books too, and I'm sure there's plenty of other anthropologists and plenty of other ethnographies that would be absolutely beautiful to read. But this is just someone that has really inspired me in my work, and so I would highly recommend checking out some of his work to learn more about cultures and the importance of diversity of cultures. Well, thank you all so much for being here with me. I wish we could all be together in person. I miss Harvest, and I can't wait till we can be together again. But until then, be safe. And oh, I do have one question, so just one moment. Okay. So the question was, what's the best way to learn about what's beneath the surface? So if you so I would say that the best way to learn beneath the surface while you're in the space that you are in is to search out ethnographies, to search out anthropological texts. There are obviously debates in anthropology. Not everyone views things the same way, but you can look up, like I have these books on intercultural communication. And in these books, it shares these beneath the surface things. And you can also research those topics yourself of what beneath the surface things you're interested in. But make sure that they're coming from like academic resources now, or from someone that's from the culture that you're interested in learning about. And if you're actually traveling to different places and wanting to know how to figure out what's beneath the surface when you're in those other places, is asking those questions. You know, sometimes people get tour guides, and tour guides generally just share what they think everyone wants to hear. But when I've traveled and talked with tour guides and asked them those beneath the surface questions, they are really excited to share those things because they often don't get asked those questions. And so take advantage of those things. Um, so yeah, it's just trying to ask those questions to whoever you can. I think I think that was the one question. Um, while I would love to connect with any of you, if any of you want to connect or find me, feel free. Reach out. I would love to chat more. But until then, stay safe and sending you all tons of love. Bye.